I think we can go ahead and start and people can continue to join. So I'm Claire from EU DisinfoLab, and we're here today to talk about the Digital Services Act with Tremau, a French startup. Let me set some kind of housekeeping rules. So this webinar is being recorded. It will be available later on for you to rewatch, or for those who are not able to join us to watch later on. Please share your questions during and afterwards in the chat, especially using the Q&A function. We're going to leave at least 15 minutes at the end for you to be able to ask specific questions to Louis Victor. So please go ahead and do that as well. And yeah, I'll introduce then EU DisinfoLab and Louis Victor, our guest today. So EU DisinfoLab, for those who are not familiar with us, is an independent NGO focused on researching and tackling sophisticated disinformation campaigns targeting the EU and EU member states. We monitor disinformation across a variety of different social media platforms, and we also conduct open source investigations. Our findings are disseminated via partnerships, media, and leading experts in the field. And one of the important things that we do here based in Brussels is we also work with policymakers and legislators. And so 2 years ago, we decided to start working on the EU Digital Services Act because we saw this as an opportunity to really address disinformation phenomenon through legislation. So just some opening words about the DSA for those of you who might not be as familiar with it. This is the EU's groundbreaking law now on internet safety and platform accountability that will impose accountability and transparency obligations on a variety of digital services operating in the EU, but with particular obligations for the largest social media platforms. The text of the regulation was agreed this spring, and it was recently adopted by the European Parliament this month, and it's due to be adopted by the Council in the fall. It won't enter into force for all digital services until 2024, but it will have an earlier date for some of the biggest players. And so I think why we're very happy to have this discussion with Tremau today is because we're really in this process now, I think, in civil society and also on the digital services side in terms of kind of processing and understanding what this text now means for us and sort of gearing up. So on the regulator side, the resources side, civil society, and digital services, of course. And so it's really great timing to have this discussion. And so now I'll introduce finally Louis Victor, who is the CEO and co-founder of Tremau. Tremau is a Paris-based technology startup developing tools for different digital players to mitigate their regulatory and operational risks. It was founded in 2021 by a team of Instead and MIT entrepreneurs and technology and policy experts. They provide trust and safety solutions and regulatory compliance tools for growing online platforms, and they work with such partners as the French NGO e-Enfance and the International Network Against Cyber Hate. Prior to launching Tremau, Louis Victor was deputy to the French ambassador for digital affairs. In this role, he specialized in issues related to tackling illegal content online and disinformation. He led France's work on the Christchurch Call to Action and the OECD Transparency Reporting Framework on terrorist and violent extremist content online. And prior to joining the ministry, he worked for a non-financial risk management consulting firm. He holds an MBA from the Institut Européen d'Administration des Affaires Internationales, and a BA from the University of Notre Dame, which in the US you pronounce is Notre Dame, the University of Notre Dame. And so yeah, Louis Victor's expertise in content moderation regulation is very much informed, I think we'll see in this discussion, by his background in compliance in the financial industry. And this is really critical. When it comes to digital regulation, I think we have a lot to learn from other sectors. So this is very, very valuable expertise that this discussion will show. So without further introduction, I'll lead into the first question that I have for Louis Victor, which is about the kind of lawful but awful content, which is sometimes thought of as gray zone content because it's not technically illegal, but it's socially harmful. And disinformation, of course, is one of the kinds of content that fits very much into this gray zone. So the DSA is very careful to take a systems approach to this kind of content, regulating processes rather than content itself. And it has separate obligations for legal and illegal content. So my question to Louis Victor is, how do you and Tremau advise platforms to approach this kind of content? And how do you think the DSA is also going to change this for platforms?
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you very much for your kind words. You're right in saying that the DSA really, in a sense, try to focus on illegal content, but also goes much broader than illegal content. And this idea of what are the awful but lawful contents, or what are the contents that a platform may decide to say, actually, we don't want that type of content on our platform, is also key in understanding how the DSA and how companies and online platforms are supposed to deal with this type of content. I think one of the ways in which the DSA is structurally going to fight against or tackle this type of content is also by imposing that every online platform start putting in place trust and safety programs or content moderation programs and processes. And that's already a first step in the direction of tackling these types of content specifically. Also, the DSA imposes that every online service provider, however big or small, implements terms of services, clear terms of services. That's one of the criteria. And in the text itself, you also have in the preamble of the text, this idea that all companies need to be able to prevent the misuse of their platform, including violation to the terms of services. So already this idea of lawful but lawful content, so content that is probably against the terms of services of many online platforms, is already something that online platforms will need to tackle and will need to be able to prove to the regulators that they are coherent with the terms of service they've put forward. And this is something that the regulators, I believe, will pay particular attention to as the DSA is being implemented, is how, what are the processes that have been implemented by these online platforms? How is the content moderation process established? Are the right steps respected? What are the key KPIs for each of the steps, et cetera, et cetera? And so, while in itself, the DSA has been very careful not to define what that kind of gray zone is, and for very good reason, because it's very different from one platform to another, and from one state to another, what is and illegal, and then it goes even to gray areas. But they've put in place the mechanisms to be able to ensure that the companies are in fact doing what they should be doing against that type of content.
Great. So it sounds like you agree with the DSA's approach also in this, broadly speaking, this strategy for gray zone content.
I think this is a personal opinion, I think it was the only way forward, because if you start trying to define at the EU level what is, first of all, legal and illegal, even that is going to be very complex. I mean, in one country you can sell Mein Kampf, and the other one it's illegal to sell the book. And then you go into what, and then you also have these issue. I always use this example, but Disney Channel will have a very different nudity policy that YouPorn.
Right.
And what is acceptable on one, it can't be acceptable, should not be acceptable on the other. But you need to be able to justify it. And I think that's the key element around the DSA, is that the company will need to be able to justify if they remove or if they do not remove the content. In both cases, they need to justify the decision of removing or not removing the content, and if it's been notified to them that this content is potentially harmful or illegal or contrary to their terms of services.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think I agree with you. I think this was the only way forward. And yeah, I think the text is really well crafted, and we'll see what it can bring for this. I next wanted you to ask you about about some of the obligations around reporting and appeals. So at EU DisinfoLab, we often find that platforms will fail to take action on disinformation content, even when that content does clearly violate platform stated terms and conditions. And this might be, a resource issue or a language issue, both of which are things the DSA will address. And because, as we know, unfortunately, many platforms are less devoted to tackling disinformation in non-English languages. So what we did at EU DisinfoLab over the past year and a half is we've advocated very strongly to have strong appeals mechanisms in the DSA, so that when users report disinformation to a platform cannot simply dismiss the report, but users can have another chance. And so the DSA concretely does this through its internal complaints handling system. This is the Article 17, where they can submit complaints to this through this mechanism for both cases of over moderation, so wrongful takedowns or wrongful actions on content, or under moderation, so the cases that we often see of failure to take action. And when these complaints contain sufficient grounds, the platform will need to reverse its decision or alert the user who reported and appealed this to other redress options. And this other redress options include what's outlined in the Article 18, which is out-of-court dispute settlement, which paves the way for the establishment of independent bodies in different member states that can deal with these disputes, but out of the regular court system. So those two articles, 17 and 18, I'd really love to know what you and Tremau think of these approaches and of the redress, generally the redress tools that the DSA is going to impose, and especially how these tools might set obligations for some of the smaller platforms as well, because these articles don't just apply to the blocked, the largest platforms, but to all online services, all online platforms, excuse me.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I think it's a great question, and I think it goes to the core of the DSA, which is really around, as you mentioned in your first question, around the process. What is the process? What are the key steps of the content moderation process? And one of the biggest, I think, assumptions around some of the key points of the regulation is that transparency in this entire ecosystem, in this entire process, is going to help make better decisions, and is also going to hold the different actors or stakeholders accountable to the decision they make. So if you take the big three steps of the process, which is, notice and action mechanism, which you said, which is, user reports, and then you have the complaint mechanism, and then you have the out-of-court dispute mechanism. It's what's really key is for these three steps, a company, online platform, will have to justify why it took the decision and why it's taking that decision. Either, yes, I agree with your notice, I'm going to remove the content. No, I don't agree with you. And as you mentioned, then there's this appeal mechanism. And this appeal mechanism is enables a second time for the user much more information and provide more information, and to say to the company, okay, this is why I disagree with you, and the company then also provides information and justifies the decision it took. In itself is not going to solve the problem. However, where it brings a great step forward, I think, is when you include transparency reports at the end of the year. When you have regulators who at the end of the year are going to say, okay, fine, well, actually twice a year are going to say, fine, please tell me, give me the numbers of notices you've received. How many have opened? How many are closed? How many are still pending? How many did you act upon? Then second, how many complaints did you have? Okay. And if you have a company that has, that closed 100% of their complaints without, doing anything, or without, changing its mind, well, maybe there's a problem with their process. And this is when the regulator is going to start looking at saying, have you actually put in place the right process? Have you put in place the right elements to be able to review the content, to actually provide enough information? That's the first thing. I know we're going to speak, I think we're going to speak a bit about trusted flaggers a bit later on, so I won't go too much in the details here, but also the fact that you have trusted flaggers and the fact that trusted flaggers also have obligations and and transparency reports to do is also going to create much more transparency, and can create mutual accountability within the ecosystem. So I really believe that the focus on the process and the focus on the transparency elements along the process is going to go a long way in holding a lot of the companies accountable to the decisions they make. And maybe in their mind, because as EU DisinfoLab, you might see the overall picture of saying a disinformation campaign, and this is part of it. And maybe that one platform would say, actually, I don't have the elements right now to take that decision, and EU DisinfoLab, could you provide me more information, etc. And that might help. So the regulators, I don't think, are going to be judging the decision in itself. They're going to be judging whether the company or the online platform actually took an educated decision, that they actually researched the content, and then they have all the elements along the process to be able to track and maintain and keep audit trails of what they've done and why they've done it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I really like that term, mutual accountability. I think that's what a lot of it is about, the sort of different stakeholders having a role. And also this emphasis that you put on the justification, I think that really makes sense. I mean, the DSA is going to be, I think I've heard described as a data generating machine. There are going to be so many transparency reports that are going to come from all of these processes in addition to other processes. So there'll be a lot of documents for us to go through on the civil society side, of course, on the regulator side. So there will definitely be some accountability that can come from really scrutinizing those reports, and all working towards this accountability vision.
Yeah. And just on this, but I think you mentioned in your introduction, basing on what I saw in the financial world and how regulators operate. This is, I believe, how regulators will or should operate in the future, which is going to be looking at these transparency reports and trying to establish, where is there systematic failure within a company? And again, I took the example, if 100% of your complaints are overturned, because that probably shows that you're doing something wrong. And this is how the regulator is also going to be able to pinpoint which company or which platform they need to go and check and verify or audit to make sure that, what they're doing and how they're doing it.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot to learn from that sector. That's great, because a lot of times reporting is seen as just purely access to justice for an individual user, but I think it really plays this much bigger role. The next question is indeed about trusted flaggers, Article 19. This is so important, and I know that Tremau has a lot to say about this. So just quickly, the DSA will oblige the largest online platforms to cooperate with trusted flaggers, who will be designated entities that have, competence in certain areas of illegal content, and they'll have privileged reporting to platforms on that regarding that content. So some platforms already have things called trusted flaggers in place or similar mechanisms. Tell us about what's different in this DSA system and what this means for both the platforms and also these external actors. And yeah, tell us about what we expect here.
There's a few things. First, in fact, Trusted Flagger program is for all online platforms. It's not only for the very every online platform will have the obligation of responding without undue delay in a timely and I can't remember the second word, in a timely manner to a Trusted Flagger report. So it will, in a sense, be a priority for online platforms to be able to respond to these Trusted Flaggers who, contrary to what was done until now, are not going to be partners that, if you're one large company, you want to work with a Trusted Flag organization because, you've been working together, etc. These Trusted Flaggers will now be named by national regulators, by the digital service coordinators, which in fact really institutionalizes the role of these actors in the ecosystem. Trusted Flaggers will now be key. They will be named by the regulators, and they will have the power to be able to send notices to any online platform operating in Europe, even outside of the country, of which they were named by the digital service coordinator, and have the obligation of also issuing transparency reports. And in those transparency reports that they will be issuing at the end of the year, they will be saying, okay, I've reached out, I reported, 10 pieces of content to company Y, and I never got any answer from them. And that's going to be a transparency report. So again, they're going to be a key player in this kind of regulatory regime, where then regulators could go and look at these reports and say, okay, who are the actors that are in fact responding to Trusted Flaggers, and who are the actors who are not at all responding to Trusted Flaggers. This, of course, imposes a number of new obligations for Trusted Flaggers as well, because as one very large online platform in the US told me, it says, okay, what happens if you have a Trusted Flag organization that starts sending, political stuff or content that's not bad at all, or caricature of a politician in a country because that Trusted Flagger is close to the local government, and these are threats that can potentially happen in some European countries. And so this idea that an online platform can report a Trusted Flag organization if they start sending too many wrongly noticed or wrongly informed complaints or reports, and the Trusted Flag organization will then lose its status. So also, as we were saying before, it creates this mutual review, this accountability, mutual accountability between the different actors in the ecosystem, where there's I'd be pushing a bit too far as saying there's checks and balances that be put in place, but it looks a bit like in a sense where, Trusted Flaggers will say, okay, this is how many reports I've sent to this platform, and the platform says yes, but out of that many reports, that many reports were unfounded and unjustified, and actually I don't agree with what you said there and there, and so it then creates a greater accountability in the overall ecosystem.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you. Indeed, Trusted Flaggers apply to all online platforms. But the question, also a follow-up question on this is, so a lot of the actors who are serving as Trusted Flaggers currently, maybe also listening to this webinar, might be working on content that's not illegal content. And so my follow-up question on this is, what about those trusted flaggers who maybe are working or want to be able to notify about content that is like in this sort of gray zone that we were talking about earlier? Do you think that the DSA is going to change things in this area?
So that's a really, really good question. I think it's a really good question for, and I think it's a good question for the regulators as well. I think it's a good question in the overall ecosystem. I realized I also forgot to answer one part of your first question, which was around how is it going to change also for very large online platforms, and the fact that you have trusted flag organizations today, or you have individuals that work within a trusted flagger program for very large online companies that will definitely not meet the requirements to become a trusted flag organization as per the Digital Services Act. This doesn't mean that very large online platforms will need to stop working with these actors. Any company can work with have its own trusted flagger program. It's just that on top of its own trusted flagger program, they will have the obligation of responding to these regulated bodies that are the DSA trusted flaggers, if I can call them that way. In regards to your second question, which is, if I can say it this way, are trusted flaggers or trusted flag organization, will they have to concentrate only on illegal content, or will they also be able to focus on the gray zone content? And Claire, of course, the EU DisinfoLab is a perfect example of an organization that focuses really on this gray area. I think, again, given the fact that companies have the obligation of fighting against the misuse of their platform, and misuse of the platform is defined as something that goes against the terms of services, trusted flag organization, while they have an obligation, they need to be able to justify if something is illegal or not and say, okay, remove this because it's illegal. Trusted flag organization will also be able to notify content saying, this is not illegal, however, it is against the terms of services, and we believe you should remove it because this and that and that. So I don't think it's going to stop them from doing it. The difference is, in that gray area, I think there's much more ability for the company, for the online platform, to get back and say, actually, we disagree. We don't think it's against the terms of services, etc. But again, this is all going to be about the transparency and the justification. But you, as a trusted flagger, if the EU DisinfoLab becomes a trusted flagger within the, as an example, within this framework or the framework of the DSA, you at the end of the year will be saying, okay, I sent 10 reports. 5 of them were the company X did something upon them. 5 of them, they told me that I was wrong and it had nothing to do. And then you can then justify. And then there'll be a discussion with the regulators as to why this company, for 50% of the time, decided that EU DisinfoLab's reports were unfounded. And then this is how I believe the discussion is going to go forward.
Yeah, exactly. More reporting will come out of this, and that will be very helpful to be able to see, how many trusted flagger notifications are going ignored or being acted on. So the next question is the one that's specific to very large online platforms. And this is that a new aspect of the DSA, a really, I think, genius innovation, is the introduction of risk assessments. So the very large online platforms and also the very large online search engines will be required to conduct assessments of their systemic risks annually, and they'll have to look at their kind of design and their features, their terms and conditions, their content moderation systems, the use of data, et cetera, and see what are the systemic risks for their users. And they'll also have to mitigate these risks. And here, fines for non-compliance go as high as 6% of annual worldwide turnover. So you at Tremau have been speaking to different stakeholders about this, to digital services and to regulators. How is everybody feeling about this new requirement?
This is, I think, the biggest unknown in its entire text. We've been speaking to some very large online platforms who really have no idea. And in fact, I don't think a lot of people have a lot of ideas of how are we going to do this? How are these risk assessments going to be undertaken? Again, going back to one of the things which you said in the introduction, which is, let's look. My belief, or what I advocate, is let's also look what's been happening in other industries before. What are some of the type of risk assessments that have been happening around conduct risk, around anti-money laundering risk assessments in the financial sector, for example, and what are the frameworks put in place? And this is something that's going to have to be invented. There are already a few organizations, researchers that have been putting out thoughts of how these should be undertaken. But there's always a question of how do you operationalize something from the idea to actually doing this first risk assessments. And as you said also in the introduction, these risk assessments are going to come very quickly, because very large online platforms will be regulated probably starting February or March of next year. So that's not in a very long time. And are going to have to start undergoing, in 2023, they will have to have done a risk assessment. And so the question is, there is a big question around how they, first of all, who's going to define the methodology? How is the methodology going to be evolve over time? Because the risk in 2023 might not be the same risk as in 2030 also. So is the methodology going to evolve? And then how are the regulators going to be able to review the risk assessments that have been undertaken? And the risk assessment should not only be around, what are the, sorry, what I'm trying to say, there's going to be a lot of difficulties around the, it's not only about analyzing the algorithms, it's also about analyzing, the ability of somebody to misuse your platform, the ability for something to, you've created a great system and then there's a twist around it. You've created a great reporting system, for example, to notice and action system, but then you realize it's overflooded by people who send you wrong notices. This is just a small example of of some of the risks that a company can face, and then it's overloaded with fake notices. And then how does it then differentiate between 80% of junk notices versus 20% of notices that are actually correct and that should be acted upon by the company to remove the harmful or illegal content? So that is still, I think, as I was mentioning, one of the biggest unknown, and there's an entire question around the framework to put in place, the methodology to do these risk assessments, and then the ability for regulators to also, verify, review the risk assessment that have been undertaken. That's part of it. And then there's a second part to the risk assessment, because the risk assessment in itself is not very, it's a good way forward, but then there's the risk mitigation factors. So what are the risk mitigators? And then that's going to be, I think, is going to be another big question, because in the text they say, okay, a company needs to prove that it's taken the right risk mitigation. But then if you analyze that, one of the systemic risk on your platform is your algorithms, or one of the algorithm you're using that, distorts or promotes, hateful content over another type of content. Who's going to be able to verify that you've taken, how regulators going to be verified that the risk mitigator that you're putting in place actually solves that problem? That's one of the questions out there also, which is how do you define the methodology around risk assessments, and how do you review and ensure that the risk mitigators are actually coherent with the overall risks that you have identified before? Of course, the regulator has mentioned the EU Code against disinformation, or the EU Code of Conduct against hate speech, as potential risk mitigators or examples of the fact that you're mitigating risks. But again, signing the code of conduct itself is not a proof that you're mitigating the risk. You actually then need to operationalize these code of conducts. How do you effectively apply the code you just signed up to? And I think those are going to be the big questions that both regulators and companies are going to be asking themselves in the next couple of months, and especially as they need to do this first risk assessments in the coming year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and civil society, I think this is where this mutual accountability comes in too. And there's so much rich information in the DSA already, and what will be even elaborated in delegated acts about how data access will relate to this as well, bringing in a lot of different stakeholders to be able to monitor that compliance. So there's a lot of work to be done. And I really like the analogy with the anti-money laundering. And I know that there's also been work done in the business and human rights space on human rights impact assessments. So there are, some prototypes in some areas, but like you said, a lot needs to be developed. A methodology remains to be developed. So there's a lot to also wait and see. And also, I'm glad that you mentioned the code of practice. I actually think that my next question is going to look at this as well, because the GSA takes, a very clearly a scaffolded approach with the requirements, applying the largest requirements like this risk assessments only to the largest players. The code of practice, of course, is the mitigation measure, is available to any signatory that would like to sign up to it and make certain commitments, but it won't necessarily have this co-regulatory effect, not when it doesn't apply to the largest players. And so for us in the counter disinformation field, we're often find that there are some of these fringe actors or smaller actors that might not qualify as VLOPs, but that play an outsized role in the dissemination of disinformation, and that clearly pose the societal risks. So what do you think of the DSA's ability, not necessarily the code of practice, but of the DSA as a whole, to kind of hold some of these smaller actors to account? What other tools are there when these risk assessments perhaps don't necessarily apply?
That's a very good question, and it really goes to this threshold idea or notion that the regulators have put the threshold at 45 million monthly users, and I think overall in the union there'll be about between 15 and 20 probably online platforms, or that's going to fall within this category. There's a couple of ways I think where these companies will be able to be held accountable. We haven't mentioned that we spoke a lot about the moderation process in itself along the way, also because it's part of our expertise also at Tremau. There's a lot of what we do and what we provide to our customers. So this is, in a sense, what I know the most. But also there's a number of other elements, obligations for online platforms that will help regulators or help civil society also hold these, I say, just below the threshold companies. There's, they have to have some type of transparency around the recommender systems. They have enhanced transparency requirements. There's transparency around the advertising that they use, and around also the ban of certain types of targeted ads. So while of course they won't have as in-depth obligations or as in-depth risk assessments, etc., I think regulators will quickly start to see that some of the platforms that are posing these, systemic threats, even though they are not very large online platforms, are going to be, and I believe, analyzed through their transparency reports at the end of the year. Okay, this type of platform is receiving a huge amount of notices of user reports, etc., etc. So there might be, or there's probably is some type of issue with this platform or some type of higher risk, and I need to be involved, and I need as a regulator to be much more upfront and much more proactive with that platform versus another platform. So that's part of it. And again, it's also about, trusted flaggers. This is where the role of trusted flaggers is going to be so important because, again, if EU DisinfoLab decides to apply for this trusted flaggers and obtains the status of trusted flaggers, you'll also be looking a lot of at these platforms that are the ones that you believe are at a high risk. And so you will be also looking more at these platforms, sending them more notices. And their failure, if they do systematically fail to respond to your reports, then that will be kind of a trigger alarm for the regulators, who will be able to then go and verify what is going on and check what's going on their platform and what are the measures that they've put in place to actually respect some of these obligations. So again, I really believe that this is an ecosystem approach, and that one of the ways that these large but under the threshold platforms, I don't think it's not because they're not in the very large online platforms that they will be under scrutinized or under reviewed by the regulators. In fact, again, regulators are still discussing how the regulatory framework is going to exactly look like, in the sense, what's probably going to happen, but again, still has to be finalized, is that very large online platforms will be in charge of regulating, the European Commission will be in charge, or will be creating a specific body who will regulate very large online platforms. And the digital service coordinators will regulate online platforms registered in their country that are below that threshold. So in fact, a company that's right below this threshold will have, in a sense, a bigger scrutiny from its national regulator, because its national regulator will not be focusing as much on the very large online platforms, which will be regulated at the Brussels level. Again, this is a hypothesis because there's still discussion as to who is going to do what, and is it going to be national regulators versus the European regulators going to assess the risk assessments? In my view, and again, looking what's happening, for example, in the banking sector, where the what we call systemic banks are reviewed and regulated by Brussels or by the European Central Bank or the European Banking Authority, and then the smaller national, or not, but like the smaller players that are not considered as European systemic are regulated by the national regulators. And I believe that we're going to go through a framework that's going to look very much like this. So yeah, one thing we say a lot to some of the clients we speak to is, it's not because you're under the very large online platforms that you won't be scrutinized. On the contrary, it might actually be even more so.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful. Again, that analogy is really helpful. And I think as an optimistic look at the role of the digital service coordinators, I do hope indeed that they are sufficiently resourced and capable of regulating the actors in their territory. I think we're going to see a huge variation among the different digital service coordinators, but they are required to have the sufficient resources to be able to regulate the players that are legally registered in their member states. So this should be a good approach. But yes, I think it's very critical that the European Commission will be overseeing the largest actors. The last question that I want to ask you before we open it up to questions from the audience is about other regulation, because the last 2 years we have been very, very focused, at least at EU DisinfoLab, on the DSA, but there are other pieces in place. There are other policy files or other regulations that already exist. And I know that Tremau does a lot of work advising your clients on this whole labyrinth of regulations. So can you tell us about some of the other things that you are working on, or the other kind of laws and policies that you advise your clients about?
Thanks, Claire. One of the elements we see common across the different regulations, which is a good sign, at least a sign that the regulators are working together, is the fact that the process, the content moderation process in itself, is always going to be very similar. I mean, the philosophy and the steps are going to be very similar. What we see, and the way the Digital Services Act has been structured also is being really a horizontal approach. So they don't define, we go back to one of the things you were saying in the beginning, Claire, which is they don't define what is illegal and what is not. And that is going to be what is called vertical regulations that are going to be responsible for doing that type of review. So of course, we all have the CSAM regulation in mind because it just came out, or the first proposition just came out, and there's going to be a lot of debate around it, around encryption, other elements that are beyond, far beyond the DSA. But if you look at the terrorist content online regulation, which is in force since the 7th of June, you really see that the process established in the DSA is completely followed by the TCO regulation, and that the TCO regulation basically says, if you have terrorist content, and if you'll be notified by a national authority you have terrorist content, then you have 1 hour to remove it. So what, in the terms of the process, it says, it's going to say, for that specific type of content, you need to be reacting much quicker, and you have much more specificities around that type of content. For CSAM, for example, is if you detect CSAM, you need to send it to a clearinghouse that's going to be held by, and these are the types of discussions that are going on, but they're going to be content specific within an overall framework that's defined by the DSA, and that is going to remain very clear within the DSA, and very much focused on the process and around the transparency of the different steps of that process.
Yeah, definitely two really important files that have been, some cases a bit more controversial than the DSA, but I think we could have full webinars about both of those other things. That's great that you're providing guidance on those issues.
But as you were saying, there's a lot of different areas also which we may sometimes we focus less on, but for example, copyright, counterfeits, all these different elements, goods, illegal goods. The DSA is also going to focus a lot on the sale of illegal goods, on counterfeit goods, of copyright, and the process we spoke about with the 3 different steps is going to have to be implemented for all these elements as well. We spoke a lot about online platforms, of course, around what we do with around your work with Disinfo, but it goes wider. An online marketplace, B2B marketplace or C2C marketplace is going to have to put in place many also requirements trying to fight against distribution of illegal goods, of counterfeit goods, of stolen goods, of all these types of elements. And there's going to be trusted flag organizations also rising in this area. Not only the big brands are going to come together and create their own trusted flag organization, or at least we haven't seen that yet, but I really presume that that's going to happen. I'd be surprised if it's not the case. And then the arrival of also other actors. For example, we had a very long discussion with UNESCO, because they are in charge of fighting against the sale of stolen cultural goods, and the fact that these platforms can be used to sell these types of content. And of course, the DSA is going to apply fully to these, to this types of content, to these use cases as well. Yeah, definitely. No, we've talked much less about the illegal behaviors in this seminar, the webinar, but there's a lot obviously in the DSA that deals with that directly, as well as other regulation. Okay, so at this point, I'd love to open it up to our audience to see if there are any questions. I also have further questions in case nobody would like to ask anything yet, but I do want to give them a minute to have a chance. I can start and then see if anybody jumps in. But the question I would ask first is going back also to this code of practice. And when it comes to this gray zone content that we've been talking about, the DSA takes this co-regulation approach. And obviously the DSA also is paving the way for future codes of conduct as well in other areas. We also have a code of conduct along illegal hate speech, a memorandum of understanding, and on illegal goods, I believe. So what do you think of this co-regulatory approach that the EU is clearly taking in terms of content moderation and online services? Do you think, can we see a trend? And what do you think about this new way? I mean, given the work I was involved in within the Christchurch call, I believe that the co-regulatory approach is essential. One thing that President Macron would always say, as especially in the framework of the Christchurch call, but also in the TCO and the DSA, but of other work we did with the Élysée when I was within the French administration, was, we find an intelligent way, because if it's only regulators working in that corner, then you have some elements like, some laws in France that got completely destroyed by Conseil Constitutionnel, and basically they go the wrong way, the wrong route. And then, and so speaking with online platforms is essential, and coming up with intelligent forms of co-regulations is essential. And actually you realize that a lot of things which both sides thought were impossible are possible when you arrive at these with these discussions, and when you start moving in this area of co-regulation. However, you also know that co-regulation in itself, I don't think it's sustainable in the long term, because we also saw that Christchurch call happened. There was a lot of improvements, and much. You look at the Buffalo attack, the companies reacted much better. But there was still a number of companies who did not react well enough. And the video was still available online for 10 hours on a specific platform, with different platform from the last one, which shows that there was progress in the ecosystem, but it was still available. And so co-regulation with no enforcement mechanism is also always going to fall short. And so you have to, and I think it's a good process, it's a good way forward. And again, if you look at the structure of the DSA, which says, these codes of conduct are a way of mitigating your risks. So in a sense, we're not imposing you, and we're also opening these codes of conduct for other companies that are not VLOPs. However, if you realize that your platform has systemic risk against, systemic risk of spreading disinformation, then you'd better sign up to it. So it is co-regulation, but it's a very, let's say, forced co-regulation at this point as well. Yeah, coerced co-regulation for some. No, that's great. So we have two questions now. I'm going to start with the second one because it's sort of about co-regulation. It's about self-reporting. So the questioner asks, that from her experience evaluating platform content moderation, a lot of this does rely on self-reporting. Is this your experience as well? And how do you think that regulators are going to be able to spot check the reliability of this information? So can you tell us about some of the ways that the DSA is going to be kind of double checking or building in these kind of double checks? So I think there's no way, and especially for the non-very large online platform, for the online platform, for the very large online platforms, because you have external audits, there will be there is going to be a lot of it's going to be much less around self-reporting. But for the online platforms, it is going to remain self-reporting. However, there are going to be some crucial steps to be able to prove that you're doing when you're reporting. And the regulation itself asks for a number of elements. So for example, it says, how much content have you removed and why? So you need to be able to say, okay, I remove X number of content that was notified by trusted flagger, a user, an AI detection tool that I'm using because it infringed this or that policy. So it is going to be rather granular. So it's going to have to be numerical, data-driven, and it's going to have to, as we were saying before, the different steps of the process are going to have to be accounted for. And so let's be realistic. The regulators are not going to check every single company to make sure that every single company has reported the data accurately. What is going to happen, though, is that the regulators are going to be able to spot overall trends in the industry and say, okay, regularly, a company of that size, okay, has X number of flagged content, from different sources, as I was mentioning, AI tools, trusted flaggers, law enforcement, user reports, et cetera, And first step of the process, the review phase, 50% of them are closed. Well, so the content is removed, and 50% of the time the cases are just closed, and it doesn't go further because they believe that the content fine. But if you're, as we were saying before on the complaint mechanism, if you're one platform where 0% of the user reports actually lead to an action, you'll probably have a problem there. And so this is where I believe the regulators is really going to focus. And it is going to remain self-declaration, but it's self-declaration on specific data that has been requested by the regulator. And then the regulator, if they believe that the information you're providing is inaccurate, is going to come and do a full-on review of your processes and audit check of what you've done over the years, and being able to then assess whether or not the information that you gave was the correct one or not. And given the fine, Claire, that you mentioned, which is 6% of global annual turnover, it's pretty significant. And companies, there's companies should not joke with this. I believe it is a significant risk.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question actually on this self-reporting, which is a big question is the number of active users that will qualify a platform as a VLOP. So they'll be required to report this number to their digital service coordinator twice yearly. This will be a self-defined number, but there are going to be rules for, and perhaps even delegated act around how this number will be counted and defined, your number of active users in the EU. I was reading, I think, and I heard this analogized to that the number of active users is almost like a currency. So this is something that is going to be throughout different kinds of regulations. It's going to appear in the political ads regulation, maybe in the upcoming Media Freedom Act. It's going to be very important to have some kind of understanding of how we count active users. I'd be really curious for your thoughts on that, also from the financial sector.
I think you're spot on. The big question is, the DSA, the first text itself can't define everything. And then these, as you said, are going to be defined in delegated acts, which again, going to the financial industry is also very common. And sometimes you actually have 3 levels of delegated, like 3 levels of you have the first text, and then you have a first version of delegated acts, and then you have implementation standards that are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long in the financial industry because it goes to the nits and bolts. I don't think it's going to go that deep for the first version. But the regulators in the EU Commission is definitely going to start, publishing much more tailored or precise elements that are going to need to be taken into account to be able to define what is and what is not an active monthly user. To be honest, I can't go into that detail right now because they've provided a high-level view of what those criteria could be, but I really believe that they will start, providing much more detailed information.
Great. Another question is about the importance of NGOs flagging content online in the future. And so I wonder if I think this person is asking about trusted flaggers, but of course there's also ways for NGOs to flag content just through the complaints mechanism, through the appeals mechanism, and also there's a role of representation under Article 68. Representative organizations can also flag content on behalf or exercise any rights on behalf of users. So is there anything you would add to this question about the importance of NGOs going forward?
I mean, especially if you are a trusted flag that's recognized as, or an NGO recognized as a trusted flag organization. By the way, trusted flag organizations don't have to be NGOs, and you could have businesses that are built for doing that. For example, around counterfeit goods, I believe that it's going to be a business out of organizations that are going to do this on behalf of LVMH and other big brands. But in regards to the reporting of by trusted flaggers, online platforms will need to have the mechanisms in place to be able to identify that this person reporting that's used the reporting mechanism is a trusted flagger, and to be able to then treat its notice in priority or without undue delay, because that's the requirement of the regulation. This doesn't mean that, and sorry, I need to recharacterize the word. It's not in priority, because it doesn't mean that you need to prioritize one over the other, that your user reports will never be reviewed because you'll always be reviewing trusted flagger reports, and that you need to review one and not the other. So it just means that you need to make sure that as a company, you're responding quickly and accurately to a trusted flagger. And they have, because of their expertise and recognized expertise in the fields, the probability that the notice they will give you, that the notice they give you is accurate, is higher. And so there's also a fact that if a trusted flagger is notifying you something, there's probably a good reason for you to remove that content quite quickly.
Yeah, great. So there's another question that came actually into the chat, which I think is a really, it's a question that we think a lot about here. And I believe that the questioner is trying to get at this idea of perhaps regulator shopping. So because the smaller platforms will be overseen by the DSC where they're established, will there be any motivation for platforms to register or to put their legal representative in certain member states where they might have maybe different, or I mean, they have the same obligations for a lot of things, but maybe where the regulator is a little bit less rigorous, perhaps. I think that is the question as a whole. They give the example of a platform focused on a smaller population, for instance, Hungarian speakers, that can skirt below the thresholds of a VLOP, and that might find some more protection in a certain member state.
That is indeed a very, very good question. And it's a very good question also because it was very much discussed. I think this was one of the big lessons learned from the GDPR regulation, which is country of origin. And can we rely simply on the regulator of where all the platforms are incorporated, that then is going to be swamped and overloaded with notices, and then, or as you said, a regulator that doesn't want to do anything about it because they believe that it's how they can attract these actors to come to that. Here, there is, and it's true with the TCO, it's also true with the DSA, there's the principle that a regulator can report or can send notices or investigate a company that's operating in its country, even though it's not legally based in the country. So that means that, if that, you were speaking about a Hungarian platform is accessible in France, then technically it's operating in France. And so the French regulator can start looking at what's happening and also can start, reporting to the European board or to the European centralized regulator saying, this platform who's regulated by X country is, clearly infringing. I see the reports from my trusted flaggers who are reporting for French trusted flaggers that are reporting that it's never being acted upon. We need to do, there needs to be something that's done about it. And so how it's going to be done operationally, again, there's going to be a lot of discussions, but I think that the DSA, and it's clearly true for the TCO, which is already implemented, so this is really it has taken a step further than the principle of country of origin. It hasn't completely removed it, but it's taken a step forward. And so it's not only going to be in this case the Hungarian regulator that's going to be able, that's going to have the ability to regulate or to say something to that platform. Other regulators in Europe will also have ability one way or another to, and again, in the TCO, very concretely in the TCO regulation, any regulator can report terrorist content to a platform operating in Europe, even if it's not legally based in the country. So the French regulator could report to content. If that platform disagrees with the content, it can file a complaint to its own regulator, and that own regulator has 72 hours to dispute that request with the authority that had reported the content. So again, it's clearly there's still the local regulator still has a role, but it's not the only one to have a role in the regulation of that platform.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned the board. There will be a board of bringing together representatives of all the digital service coordinators that will sort of advise and oversee the implementation. And I think this board will have a very important role, as you're describing, in making sure that all of the digital service coordinators are doing their role, also in sharing best practices. And so at least at EU DisinfoLab, we're hopeful that this board will be a strong and useful force, but it will bring together a lot of very different kinds of actors as well. So we'll have to see how this all functions. If there are not any other questions, I would just take a minute to thank you very much, Louis-Victor, for your time, for sharing it with us, for giving us your insights about this. And I'm sure people can get in touch with you by getting in contact with Tremau. Just thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us about the DSA. We'll have to talk with you soon, also when the regulation enters force and when we have some of these reports. There's one, okay, maybe if you have a minute, there's one last question that I might sort of go out on. It's a follow-up question from the same person, which wants to know about some detail on the metrics that are required to become a BLOP. Maybe this is more of a technical question, but they want to know, do they take into account only the number of users, or do they take into account the volume of the activity? They say it seems to them that a platform with 1 million users, but who rarely post, is very different than a platform with 200,000 users. Right. So my understanding, and you can correct me, Victoria, is that it's about the active user. It's not about the activity of that user. But this will also, be for secondary legislation.
Yes, that's also my understanding. Why? Because even though the 200K platform has, and of people that have significant, activity, poses less of a systemic risk because it reaches to less number of people than a platform that can reach 2 million users. Again, I'd be really for all these questions, and if you have any particular questions, I'd be very happy to answer them in any way. As Claire said, you can reach out to us on our website very easily, and I'd be happy to answer any follow-on questions if needed.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks everybody, and have a good rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Claire. Very interesting conversation.
Yeah.